The bell above the door of Hometown Cafe jingled as Ricardo Mendoza entered, his tailored Italian suit immediately standing out among the casual attire of the other patrons. The small Arizona town was merely a pit stop on his journey to an important business merger in Phoenix, and his irritation at the delay was evident in his sharp, calculating eyes. Daniela Flores approached his table with a warm smile that had become second nature during her 5 years of waitressing. "Welcome to Hometown Cafe? Can I start you off with something to drink?" Ricardo barely glanced up from his platinum watch. In rapid Spanish, he muttered to his assistant Jorge, who sat across from him. "Por que tenemos cucumber en este lugar tan bosico. Apuesto a que esta mazera ni siquiera sabe lo que es un buen vino." Why do we have to eat in such a basic place? I bet this waitress doesn't even know what good wine is. Closing parenthesis. Jorge shifted uncomfortably but said nothing as Ricardo continued. "Mira su uniform barato. Personas como ella nacen para servir a personas como nosotros." Look at her cheap uniform. People like her are born to serve people like us. Daniela's smile didn't waver as she stood patiently, pen poised above her notepad. When Ricardo finally acknowledged her with a dismissive wave and ordered water in English, she responded with perfect composure. "Entiendo perfectamente lo que es un buen vino, señor. Prefiero un tempranillo de Rioja, aunque dudo que alguien tan superficial como usted pueda apreciar los matices." "I understand perfectly what good wine is, sir. I prefer a Tempranillo from Rioja, although I doubt someone as superficial as you could appreciate the nuances." The color drained from Ricardo's face as Jorge stifled a laugh. Daniela continued in flawless Spanish. "Su agua estará aquí en un momento. Y por cierto este uniforme barato paga las medicinas de mi padre. De choila serve estudes trage caro sino cubrir un corazón decente." Your water will be here in a moment. "And by the way, this cheap uniform pays for my father's medicine. What good is your expensive suit if it doesn't cover a decent heart?" She switched back to English, her voice steady. "I'll give you gentlemen a moment with the menus." As she walked away, the diner fell silent. Ricardo sat frozen, his arrogance shattered by the unexpected encounter with a woman who had just seen through his carefully constructed facade and called him out on it in front of everyone. Jorge leaned forward. "Boss, I think you might have be quiet," Ricardo snapped, watching Daniela as she efficiently served another table, her dignity intact while his lay in pieces around him. Asterisk. Ricardo couldn't focus on the contract papers before him at the motel. The waitress's words had lodged in his mind like splinters. He had dismissed the incident at lunch, leaving a deliberately modest tip and exiting without another word. But her eyes, intelligent and unflinching, followed him still. "You're distracted," Jorge observed, organizing their presentation materials. "Is it about what happened at the diner?" Ricardo scoffed. "Of course not. Why would I care about some small-town waitress?" "Perhaps because she spoke better Spanish than you do," Jorge replied with a rare boldness. "I looked her up while you were in the shower. Her name is Daniela Flores." "You what?" Ricardo sat upright. "Why would you?" "Because I was curious." Jorge interrupted. "This town is small enough that everyone knows everyone. The receptionist told me Daniela studied international relations at Universidad Complutense in Madrid on a full scholarship. She was heading toward a diplomatic career until her father's multiple sclerosis diagnosis 3 years ago. She came back to care for him and took whatever work she could find." Ricardo fell silent, remembering his own father who had worked 3 jobs to put him through business school. The memory was uncomfortable. He had deliberately buried it beneath years of ambition and acquisition. "The receptionist said something else interesting," Jorge continued. "Daniela translates medical documents remotely for the local hospital. She's also tutoring several local business owners in Spanish to help them better serve their growing Hispanic clientele." "Why are you telling me this?" Ricardo asked sharply. "Because you've been staring at the same page for 30 minutes, Jorge replied. "And because in 15 years working for you, I've never seen anyone affect you this way." The next morning, Ricardo found himself driving past the diner before their meeting. He slowed, noticing Daniela through the window. She was helping an elderly man with a cane into a booth, her father, he presumed. The gentleness in her movements contrasted with the firmness she had shown him at the business meeting. Ricardo found himself distracted again. When asked about community investment initiatives, something he typically delegated without thought, he surprised himself by requesting information about local healthcare programs. That evening, he told Jorge he needed air and walked alone through the unfamiliar town. His steps led him back to the diner, now closed. Through the window, he saw Daniela counting the register, her face tired but peaceful. As he watched, she looked up suddenly and caught his gaze. Recognition flashed across her face, followed by wariness. Ricardo felt an unfamiliar sensation: shame. He had judged her based on her uniform, dismissing her as inconsequential, while she had accurately seen through his expensive facade to the insecurity beneath. Before he could decide whether to enter or leave, Lalella walked to the door and opened. Did you come back to insult the decor in Italian this time?" she asked, a hint of humor in her voice. Ricardo found himself speechless for the second time in her presence. Double quotes, he began, then stopped. For a man who closed million-dollar deals with his eloquence, words suddenly seemed inadequate. "I came to apologize," he finally said, the phrase feeling foreign on his tongue, "and perhaps ask about your father's medical care." Daniela's expression shifted from surprise to cautious curiosity. Why would you care about that? It was a simple question, but Ricardo realized he had no simple answer. Whatever had brought him here went deeper than guilt or curiosity had touched, something long dormant within him. "I don't know why I care," Ricardo admitted as they sat in a corner booth of the closed diner. The honesty felt strange, liberating, and terrifying simultaneously. He rarely spoke without calculating the effect of his words. Daniela studied him while absently wiping down a salt shaker. "At least that's not a rehearsed answer." She set the salt shaker aside. "My father worked construction for 30 years, helped build half the houses in this town. Now he can barely hold a spoon some days." Ricardo nodded, remembering his father's calloused hands. "My meeting was postponed until tomorrow afternoon. I was wondering if I could meet him." Daniela's eyebrows rose. "Why?" "Because I made assumptions about you based on nothing. I'd like to not do that again." A small smile played at her lips. "That's probably the least eloquent sentence you've spoken in years." Ricardo found himself chuckling. The next morning, Ricardo arrived at a modest house on Cypress Street. Flower pots lined the porch, splashes of color against peeling paint. Daniela answered his knock, surprise evident in her expression when she saw he'd come alone. "Jorge is finalizing the presentation," he explained, feeling strangely nervous. He'd handed her a check the previous night, a donation to the town's medical assistance program earmarked for MS treatment, but she had neither accepted nor rejected it, simply folding it into her pocket with a thoughtful expression. Inside, Fernando Flores sat in a wheelchair by a window filled with sunlight. Despite his frail body, his eyes were sharp and assessing. "Papa estes Ricardo Mendoza, el hombre de negocios del QT Hable." "Dad, this is Ricardo Mendoza, the businessman I told you about." "Ah, el hombre rico q. Pinsa ql. Dinero equivala. A character. The rich man who thinks money equals character." Fernando's voice was soft but clear. His Spanish melodic with a regional accent Ricardo recognized from his childhood. "Guilty," Ricardo replied in English, then switched to Spanish. "Aunque estoy aprendiendo que estaba equivocado sobre muchas cosas." "Though I'm learning I was wrong about many things," Fernando gestured to a chair. "Sit." Over the next hour, Ricardo learned about Fernando's life, how he had come to America with nothing, worked construction jobs that broke his body but built a future for his daughter, saved every penny for her education. Daniela occasionally interjected, translating medical terms Ricardo didn't know, her hand resting protectively on her father's shoulder. "She says you run companies," Fernando said, switching to accented English. "What do you build?" The question was simple but profound. Ricardo usually spoke of acquisitions, market share, Profit margins? Lately, nothing. I move money around and take credit for other people's work. Fernando nodded, as if Ricardo had confirmed a suspicion. Man must build something in this life. Doesn't matter if it's a house, a family, or just his own character. Otherwise, what's the point? Ricardo glanced at Daniela, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. I used to want to build something meaningful, he admitted. A foundation for sustainable businesses in underserved communities. My father believed in that. What happened to this dream? Fernando asked. Ricardo looked down at his hands, smooth, uncalloused, adorned with an expensive watch. It made less. Money. The brutal honesty of his answer hung in the air. Fernando didn't condemn him, merely nodded slowly. Never too late to pick up your tools again. Later, as Daniela walked him to his car, Ricardo found himself reluctant to leave. He's a remarkable man, yes, she agreed. He taught me that dignity doesn't come from what you have, but from how you treat others. Ricardo leaned against his car, the Phoenix D-Litz, a tech company that would eliminate about 200 local jobs. Very profitable. Daniela said nothing, just watched him with those perceptive eyes. I think, Ricardo said slowly, I need to reconsider some things. As he drove away, Ricardo realized the check remained in Daniela's pocket, neither accepted, nor returned. Bridge perhaps, still under construction. 3 weeks after leaving the small town, Ricardo sat in his penthouse office overlooking the Miami skyline, a familiar restlessness gnawing at him. The Phoenix deal had been modified, not canceled, but restructured to preserve most of the local jobs while still ensuring profitability. His board members had been confused by his insistence, but he had stood firm. On his desk sat a handwritten letter from Daniela. She had finally cashed his check not for her father directly, but to establish a small foundation for families affected by chronic illness in her community. She had named Ricardo as an advisory board member in case you're serious about building something worthwhile again. You've been distracted since Arizona, remarked Vivian, his chief financial officer, entering with quarterly reports. The board is still questioning the Phoenix Compromise. Ricardo gestured to the chair across from him. Do you remember why? I started Mendoza Enterprises, Vivian. The original mission. She looked surprised. Something about sustainable development. That was before my time. Community-centered business models that generate profit while addressing local needs. He recited the words once so familiar now, feeling like a relic from another life. My father was a janitor who died believing his son would change how businesses interact with communities. Vivian set down her tablet. What's happening, Ricardo? First Phoenix, now this nostalgic mood? Is everything okay? Ricardo slid Daniela's letter across the desk. As Vivian read, he explained his encounter with the waitress, who had challenged his perception of worth and success. So you're what? Reinventing yourself because a waitress called you out? Vivian asked, not unkindly. No, Ricardo replied, considering his words carefully. I'm remembering who I wanted to be before I convinced myself that net worth was the only measure of success. That weekend, Ricardo did something he hadn't done in years. He visited his father's grave in the modest cemetery where he'd been buried, far from the luxury Ricardo now inhabited. He brought simple flowers and sat on the ground, ignoring the dirt on his expensive pants. I met someone who reminded me of you, Papa, he said quietly. She has your kind of courage. The following week, Ricardo called an emergency board meeting. Jorge watched with barely concealed amusement as Ricardo presented a restructuring plan that reallocated 30% of their annual profits toward community development projects and sustainable business initiatives. This is radical, protested one board member. Shareholders will revolt. Actually, Ricardo countered, studies show that companies with strong social responsibility programs outperform their counterparts by an average of 17% over 5 years. I've included the data in your packets. He had done his research, rekindling his passion for the work that had once driven him. Late nights were no longer filled with meaningless social events, but with planning and learning or discovering the vision that money and status had obscured. Ricardo found himself calling Daniela regularly, ostensibly to discuss the foundation, but increasingly to share ideas and seek her perspective. Her practical wisdom and unflinching honesty became a compass he hadn't realized he needed. "You don't sound like the same man who insulted me in Spanish," she remarked during one call. "I don't feel like him either," Ricardo admitted. "No, I'm still figuring out who I am instead." "That's the work of a lifetime," Daniela replied. "My father says, true wealth is having the courage to rebuild yourself when necessary." After hanging up, Ricardo opened his laptop and began researching small-town economic revitalization programs. For the first time in years, the prospect of work filled him with purpose rather than just ambition. On his desk calendar, he circled a date 3 weeks away, the first meeting of Daniela's foundation, which he had committed to attend in person. The thought of returning to the small town filled him with an anticipation that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the person he was becoming. 1 year later, Ricardo stepped out of a modest hybrid car, his Maserati long, sold, and walked toward Hometown Cafe. The diner looked different now. Fresh paint brightened the exterior, and a small patio with cheerful umbrellas welcomed patrons. A discreet plaque by the entrance acknowledged the Flores Mendoza community. Business initiative. Inside, Ricardo nodded to familiar faces. He was no longer an outsider here, but a regular visitor whose initial notoriety had transformed into genuine respect. He slid into his usual booth by the window where he could see the town square and the newly renovated community center across. "The street, your usual?" asked Tomas, a teenager whose college fund was among the first scholarships Ricardo had personally established. "Please, is Daniela in the office?" Tomas nodded, going over the summer program details with the committee. Ricardo sipped his coffee, reflecting on the unlikely journey of the past year. His corporate restructuring had indeed caused an initial shareholder revolt. But as projected, their long-term strategy was already showing promising results. More importantly, Mendoza Enterprises had become a case study in ethical business transformation. Featured in publications that once only celebrated profit margins, the bell above the door jingled. And Fernando entered, using a walker, but moving with greater ease than when Ricardo had first met him. The experimental treatment program, funded in part by Ricardo's initial donation, had slowed his disease progression significantly. Fernando greeted him warmly in Spanish. "You early for the ceremony?" "I wanted to see the diner." "At its regular pace first," Ricardo replied, helping Fernando into the seat across from him. "Everything looks good." "Better than good," Fernando agreed. "Daniela says the business incubator has already helped launch 15 new local enterprises, the diner now partly owned by its employees through a cooperative structure Ricardo had. Help Design had become the heart of a revitalization effort. The same business acumen Ricardo had once used solely for profit now served a dual purpose, creating sustainable models that generated both economic and social returns. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," Ricardo said, uncharacteristically. "Nervous about Daniela." Fernando's eyes twinkled. "You want my blessing to court my daughter properly?" Ricardo nearly spilled his coffee. "How did you—" "I may be old and sick, but I'm not blind," Fernando chuckled. "The way you look at her, the way she speaks of you. These things a father notices." Ricardo cleared his throat. "I've been hesitant. Our worlds were so different," Fernando emphasized. "Now, not so much. You've built bridges between those worlds." He reached across the table and patted Ricardo's hand. "But remember, my daughter values honesty above all else. Your expensive words won't impress her only. Your true heart will." Later that afternoon, as sunlight bathed the town square, Ricardo stood before a gathered crowd. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the expanded community center marked a milestone. For the foundation that had begun with a single check in Daniela's vision, "A year ago I came to this town, believing my worth was defined by my wealth." Ricardo addressed the audience, his gaze finding Daniela in the front row. "I met someone who showed me that true value lies in what we build together and how we lift each other up." After the applause and formalities, Ricardo and Daniela walked through the garden behind the community center, a quiet space she had designed for patients and families. "Dealing with chronic illness? Your speech was good," she said, brushing a leaf from a bench before sitting. Though you left out the part where you insulted me in Spanish. Ricardo laughed, joining her on the bench. I thought that might undermine the inspirational tone. I prefer the messy truth to polished narratives, she replied, smiling. The afternoon sun caught the amber highlights in her hair, now familiar to him, yet still captivating. And here's a messy truth, Ricardo said, taking her hand. I came to this town thinking I had everything figured out. You showed me I had nothing that truly mattered. And now... He paused, finding the right words. Now I find myself hoping to build something permanent with you if you're willing. Daniela's expression softened. Are you sure? And my world is still. Here, my father, this community. Your company is still in Miami. The company can be run from anywhere, Ricardo replied. But a life has to be built where your heart is. He gestured toward the town. I've been looking at that empty storefront on Maple Street. It would make a perfect satellite office and community business center. Daniela studied him, her gaze both tender and evaluating. You've changed. You helped me remember who I was. Beneath all the things I thought I needed to be, Ricardo said simply, as they walked back toward the celebration. Daniela's hand remained in his, a bridge between their once separate worlds, now joined by understanding, respect, and love that had begun with an insult in Spanish and a reply that had changed everything.